This is Raymonda, Marius Petipa's classic story ballet, one of the most successful of his career, that first premiered in 1898. Even though it's considered a masterpiece, no UK company currently performs this celebrated work in full, with most companies presenting only Act 3. Why has this acclaimed ballet been neglected for so long, and how can it be reclaimed for audiences today?
The fact is that it is a piece that is not presented because it is problematic in its narrative, but that artistically deserves to be preserved.
Tamara Rojo, world-renowned ballet dancer and artistic director of English National Ballet, Raymonda will be her first time directing and choreographing.
The music was already there, the most extraordinary score ever written for ballet. I was very clear in my mind that I wanted to present as much as possible of the traditional choreography of Petipa. This is not, as it were, a new creation. It is very much an adaptation. The original Raymonda was very much based on the Crusades, with all that that implies.
In the original ballet, Raymonda is a French noblewoman engaged to marry Jean de Brienne. Jean must leave to fight in the medieval Crusades. While he's away, Raymonda is introduced to Abderakhman, an Arab knight who promises her riches and power in exchange for love. When Raymonda rejects him, he tries to abduct her. Jean returns just in time, defeating Abderakhman in single combat, leaving Jean to marry Raymonda.
One of the challenges that I've had with classical repertoire as a performer myself is that very often the female lead is a very thin character. In the case of Raymonda, who is in the ballet throughout, there's almost nothing about her in the ballet.
Lucinda Coxon, established playwright and screenwriter, with credits including The Danish Girl. She is the dramaturg, working with Tamara on the new narrative for Raymonda.
Original Raymonda is not a ballet that I knew, and when I came to it, I was struck by the kind of thing that you would be struck by in a great deal of the classical repertoire in theatre and opera and ballet, which is that times change and there are lots of attitudes that we now would find antiquated and unacceptable. And in some ways they're tedious, and in some ways they're offensive. It's called Raymonda, and yet as the central character, Raymonda herself is a person with very little agency. She's extremely passive. She's torn between two men. One of the men is Abderakhman, and that's a portrayal of an Arab man that's extremely problematic. It's racist in all kinds of quite uncomfortable ways. He's portrayed as a kind of sex predator apart from anything else. And that iteration of the story felt not only offensive to him, but to Raymonda as well. We were really excited to find a version of the story that didn't take place during the Crusades, that didn't have the problems that come with that, and to find a way of reframing the story in a context that would allow all of those leading characters to have a little bit more, just to feel a bit more present and to show themselves in a more interesting and developed light.
And therefore I looked at other wars where those challenges could be reframed, and also at a war that will feel quite close to the British traditions and culture.
The Crimean War. It was an enormously popular war in Britain. In the Crimean War, you have a war where the British and the French and the Arab forces from the Ottoman Empire fought on the same side against the Russians. So it's quite unusual. You've got the British and French forces allied with a Muslim force against the Russian Christian forces. But the newspapers supported that because there was fear about Russian expansionism. And so this idea of the British supporting the little man, supporting the underdog, was very easy to parlay into popular support for the war.
With Raymonda now set in the Crimean War, this offers the chance to revisit the characters.
The beauty about the Crimea War is that it's the first war where women were actively involved in the war.
Women at home knew a great deal about the war because of the newspaper reports and the letters that were coming home. And once it was understood that conditions in the hospitals in particular were very terrible, there was a great war effort where women were, including Queen Victoria, were knitting scarves and socks for soldiers. And many women went to the war either to be part of the campaign or to observe as spectators, and they wrote letters home. Everybody who went wrote home describing it. And so there's an enormous amount of primary source material that's really thrilling to look at.
That gave me the opportunity to justify frontline that had women. And these were the nurses. The Crimean War was terrible because most of the deaths were due to illness, infection, lack of sanitation. What I wanted to show was that at that time, it's kind of the beginning of the change of the role of women in British society. Raymonda is inspired by Florence Nightingale.
In Florence Nightingale, we have this extraordinary role model that really gave us a lot of insights about who Raymonda might be. Florence Nightingale, who came from a well-off liberal family, who was extremely highly educated, but who felt that her life had been quite circumscribed because she was a woman. When Florence Nightingale was born in 1820, there were no female doctors. When she died in 1910, it was a woman doctor who signed her birth certificate, who registered the death. So that's the kind of historical period. In those 90 years, that's what had changed. And Florence Nightingale was part of that, and our Raymonda is part of that period.
The fact that Florence Nightingale herself was not a great supporter of the suffragettes, she, in her role, in her decisions, in her personal life, was fighting for the same freedom. And that's what we see in this character. She is a woman that comes from an upper class, but that wants to have an impact in the world and wants to have an independent life that is not dependent on marriage.
How does updating the setting and characters then affect the rest of the ballet?
Jean de Brienne in the original version is obviously considered in many ways the hero of the piece, and I think we take a slightly more nuanced view of that. The idea that Raymonda should be flattered to have an offer on the table from Jean de Brienne is not something that we were terribly convinced by. And so I think our Jean de Brienne is a slightly more kind of nuanced creature, and he has slipped a little off his pedestal.
John de Brienne, which is usually Jean de Brienne, John de Brienne is a neighbor of the same class who presents himself, goes forward to the war as part of the Light Brigade. He's a gentleman. He is the person everybody expects Raymonda will marry. They get along, they come from the same background, they've known each other since they were children. He clearly is devoted to her. And so she uses that excuse to go to Crimea to become a nurse.
Well, the old character of Abderakhman is, as we've said, a kind of sleazy sexual predator who arrives uninvited. Our Abdur is an ally, a very sophisticated, educated individual who's who has friends in Britain, who is extremely widely travelled and very well connected. He has come to Britain to help with a campaign of propaganda to support the press's efforts to bring Britain into the war and to keep public opinion riding in favour of that decision.
John and Abdur were friends, and so when John goes to war, when he's called to actually to the battle, he kind of asks Abdur to take care of Raymonda while in his absence.
So I think theirs is a genuine, they forge a genuine connection together, and he is able to see and love a kind of sensuality in Raymonda that perhaps no one else is very interested in, or that other people are afraid of, and he is unafraid of it, and that is a very exciting discovery for her.
Driving the story forward is the sumptuous music by Alexander Glazunov.
It is difficult to describe the music because it is genuinely exquisite and overwhelming. Glazunov is an extraordinary composer, and there are some pieces in this ballet that are just so absolutely beautiful. They are full of color, They are full of, inspired by all these Middle Eastern, Turkish dances. There's also waltzes. So it's a very colorful and evocative score that actually helps a lot with the character themselves. Sometimes too much. Sometimes it pushes you all the way to the old narrative.
So, what needs to change in the score to make the story work? Music director Gavin Sutherland is tasked with adapting the score. Under his baton, English National Ballet Philharmonic will perform it live.
It is the most ravishing piece of music. It is scintillating, it is characterful, it's dramatic, it's gloriously romantic. Glazunov's score needs to be adapted for this new version because tempering the piece to Tamara's ideal and her vision for the production, and of course her own take on the synopsis, we had to be extra careful with the logistics of the themes for the various characters, for the positioning of the dance in order to pace it against the dramatic flow of the piece. And also just to ensure that Glazunov is given the best light, because this score is absolutely ravishing. So the music needs to drive the narrative quite a lot of the time, and so as a result, specific themes for specific characters need to be highlighted. The principal leitmotif is for Abderakhman. He has something that is very dashing and it's very commanding, and it's usually quite low in pitch in the theme, and it always has this particular triplet feel. So you've got dee-da-da-dum, you have a triplet there, but it is also very marked, and so sometimes you get and so on. Other times you get it as a romantic solo. You know, it's beautiful, and it becomes huge, colossal, and towering, passionate orchestration as well, you know, with lots of strings. But Abdur's theme is essentially weaving its way right across the production. Raymonda has then there is the call to war. You know, da 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 da. You've got a trumpet, very clearly a Russian trumpet blowing a real triumphant musical call. The guards, because they're Abderakhman's guards, they of course have Abderakhman's theme. And so on. You know, so it's all big and dashing. In preparing Tamara's production, we talked and worked a lot on what we could extract to make it relevant to Tamara's synopsis, her take on the synopsis. And yes, that did mean leaving out some music. It did mean reconstructing some of the order of the music. But I truly believe that what we have come up with and what we have settled on is the best possible representation of this ravishing score. You get all of the relevant dance, you get all of the relevant dramatic pace, and you also get some thumping good tunes. For the premiere, there'll be 65 musicians performing in the orchestra pit, and you know, there's a vast welter of colour, big palette of colour, as well as the standard symphony orchestra of the Russian classical era. We also have a Celeste, which of course Tchaikovsky brought to prominence with Sugar Plum Fairy. We are having a traditional Hungarian music sound in Act 3 on stage. So we will have a cimbalum, which is like a zither that sits flat and you play it with rubber beaters. And then there is a hurdy-gurdy, a string instrument which you play with a handle and keys, and we think it's going to be interesting to do. This is a very special moment for me because this is the first time that our orchestra, the ENB Philharmonic, has performed Raymonda complete. It's a considerable responsibility, especially as one has to invest so much in making sure that the very best of Glazunov is in the score, it's used properly, and it fits like a glove with the dramatic and balletic intent on stage.
How will the ballet come together visually? Designing both the sets and costumes is Anthony MacDonald.
I mean, I was fascinated by the fact that it was Raymonda, which is a piece I'd never seen except for the last act, like most other people. And It's a 3-act ballet, so it's something meaty to get your teeth into. And I was fascinated by the whole idea of re-examining something which had become a little bit toxic. So, and also it was a chance to work with this company, which I did work for many, many years ago. Because we're setting it during the Crimean War, which, like the American Civil War, was one of the first wars ever to be photographed. And there's quite a lot of photographic record. Roger Fenton, this famous photographer who was in the Crimea, took a lot of photographs, rather wonderful photographs. And so that was in some ways my starting point. And the character of Roger Fenton is basically a photographer within the piece. And then this idea of photographic prints became an idea which we were going to use for the 3 different acts. So that's basically the kind of concept for the set. There are about 630 costumes being made for this production. It's set in the 1850s, but in discussion with Tamara, we didn't want to do anything that was too, like, historically really correct, just because we didn't want it to look like too literal. I think the thing about it is that, you know, being a ballet as opposed to a drama, it's a more poetic approach to it. So obviously I looked at the clothes of the 1850s, but I always, when I design something, I guess I'm very influenced by certain elements of fashion, contemporary. I'm always fascinated when fashion designers have taken historical detailing and kind of reinvented it. Also talking to Tamara, she said, I don't want any tutus. So there are no tutus. And at the same time, she wanted that the characters have a certain amount of reality. We've gone for something much more naturalistic, where the characters are more individual. But with the uniform for, that we've chosen for the Crimean War is quite far away from what they really wore. I think I also looked at that film of The Charge of the Light Brigade by Tony Richardson. I think both Tamara and I have been influenced by the film because it uses sort of cartoons and things at the beginning, which give you the context of the Crimean War. And we're doing a version of that ourselves. So you see headlines, you see Raymonda's journey to the Crimea, done in a sort of cartoon way. I hope that it's a visual world that we're creating, that it enriches the piece, that it makes the choreography clear. They have a sense of history without being bombarded by lots of detail. I'm rather depending on these backcloths to give this idea of where we are. There are elements in the set that stay the same because I have this photographic idea that they're within old-fashioned photo frames, like in an old camera.
Last but not least, the dancers of English National Ballet will bring it to life on stage.
I know the dancers well. I've worked alongside them for many years now. I know what their strong features are of each individual dancer. I also know that they respond well to challenges, that they like it. So many choreographers have said how wonderful it is to work with the company. It really is. It's wonderful to work with the dancers of the company because they are, like I said, so incredibly open and creative and talented that you can keep pushing and keep exploring new things.
I think audiences will have many of the pleasures that the original versions of Raymonda gave them in terms of it being a kind of sweeping story about intimacy and about world events. So it remains a story about grand passions, but the grand passions are slightly differently framed. And I think one of the things that it will do is really illuminate the role of Raymonda herself in the period, and it puts her centre stage in a way that perhaps hasn't always been the case.
I'm hoping that we've found a way to bring the piece to life just as much as the original does, and also to allow us to hear all of the relevant themes, all of the relevant dance music, and above all of the relevant drama and passion that this story and Tamara's take on this story demands.
Yeah, I hope that people, the audience that come and see it, will enjoy it, that they'll be intrigued by the piece, that because it'll be something new, completely new for them, because no one's seen the 3-act Raymonda, and this is completely reinvented.
I guess I'm doing, to a certain extent, the ballet I would like to sit through, the ballet I would like to watch.